You know those rare instances when someone completely flips the script and takes control of a conversation? That's exactly what Usha Vance did when faced with a loaded question designed to put her on the defensive. But instead of stumbling, she turned the tables in the most brilliant way possible. The atmosphere inside the Grand Summit Conference Hall buzzed with energy as some of the most influential minds in politics, media, and business gathered for an exclusive leadership summit. The event, held in a lavish ballroom adorned with towering chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a sleek modern stage, was more than just an intellectual gathering. It was a proving ground for ideas, influence, and control. Attendees, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, sipped their drinks while exchanging measured words, knowing that every statement made here carried weight far beyond the walls of this room. The discussion had been billed as a deep dive into leadership, values, and public responsibility, but beneath the polished smiles and professional decorum, everyone understood the real stakes. This was not just a polite exchange of ideas, it was a battlefield. Among the distinguished panelists sat Usha Vance, a Yale-educated attorney with a reputation for sharp intellect and unshakable composure. Though she had built an impressive career in law, the public often viewed her through a different lens, as the wife of Senator J.D. Vance. But tonight, Usha wasn't here as a senator's wife. She was here as a formidable speaker in her own right. At the center of the stage, directing the conversation, was Elliot Graves, a seasoned media personality and debate moderator. Graves had made a name for himself by challenging high-profile figures, forcing them into uncomfortable corners, and turning their stumbles into viral moments. His signature style, sharp, calculated, and often ruthless, was why audiences tuned in, and why panelists came prepared for an ambush. For the first half of the discussion, the conversation flowed smoothly, covering broad themes of decision-making, integrity, and the responsibilities of public figures. But those who knew Graves' reputation could sense what was coming. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a smirk creeping onto his face as he shuffled his notes, his body language tightening ever so slightly. Then, he leaned forward, eyes locked onto Usha, and dropped the question that would change everything. "Usha, as the wife of a controversial senator, do you ever regret marrying J.D. Vance?" The moment Elliot Graves posed the question, a palpable shift swept through the Grand Summit Conference Hall. The audience, once engaged in a measured discussion on leadership and values, now sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of what had just been asked. "Usha, as the wife of a controversial senator, do you ever regret marrying J.D. Vance?" The words hung in the air. Deliberate, calculated, a well-placed trap. Graves wasn't just asking a question, he was setting a stage, crafting a moment designed to put Usha on the defensive. For a brief second, even the panelists seemed taken aback. A few exchanged glances, recognizing that this was no ordinary discussion about leadership or policy. The audience, corporate leaders, journalists, political strategists, leaned in, eyes locked onto the stage. Even the camera operators instinctively adjusted their focus, ready to capture every flicker of emotion, every subtle shift in posture. Graves sat back in his chair, his smirk widening just slightly. This was his specialty, baiting guests into a sense of ease before striking with a question sharp enough to leave them fumbling. He had done it countless times before, and he expected the usual responses: nervous laughter, hesitation, or a rushed justification. He didn't need Usha to say she regretted her marriage. All he needed was a stumble, an awkward pause, a flicker of doubt that could be dissected and spun into headline. But Usha Vance was no ordinary guest. Instead of reacting immediately, she simply sat there. The silence thickened, stretched across the room like an invisible force. Not a flinch, not a flicker of discomfort. The tension in the hall deepened. Elliot had expected a reaction, but not this. The tension in the hall deepened. Elliot had expected a reaction, but not this. For the first time that evening, it was clear Usha was not the one caught off guard. The weight of the question pressed against the room like an invisible force, yet Usha Vance remained perfectly still. She didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't fidget, didn't even glance at the moderator. Instead, she let the moment breathe. allowing the question and its intent to settle in the air like an unspoken challenge. The longer she remained silent, the more uncomfortable the audience became. Not her. Murmurs died down, shifting turned to stillness, and eyes locked on to Usha, waiting. The sheer control of her presence was undeniable. Elliot Graves, usually in control of the tempo, shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. He had expected an immediate response, a nervous laugh, a quick denial, or even an attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere. But Usha was doing none of those things. She was making him wait. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds, an eternity on live television. Camera lenses zoomed in, producers behind the scenes exchanged glances, and even the panelists sensed something extraordinary was happening. Finally she moved, but not in a way anyone expected. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, she repeated the question back to him. "Regret," she said, as if the very idea was foreign to her, something so absurd it was barely worth considering. The single word hung in the air, not as a question seeking clarity, but as a statement, a challenge to the very premise behind the question. The audience could feel it. Elliot had walked her into a trap, but she had no intention of stepping into it. The smirk on Elliot's face wavered. He had set up this moment, expecting control. But now, the power in the room had shifted. What had started as an attempt to make Usha stumble had now become something entirely different. The question no longer had power over her. She had taken control of it. Elliot Graves barely had a chance to react before Usha Vance seized full control of the moment. She didn't just answer the question, she dismantled it with precision. Taking a measured breath, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, her composure unwavering. She wasn't playing defense, she was taking charge. "You know, I always find these kinds of questions fascinating," she said, her voice calm but laced with something sharper. A quiet, unmistakable challenge. The audience stirred. They recognized what was happening. Usha wasn't fumbling for an answer. She was dissecting the question itself, unraveling it thread by thread. "I mean, I could sit here and tell you all the reasons why I love and respect my husband, why we've built a life together, why I'm proud of him." She paused, letting the words settle, then added, "But somehow, I don't think that's the answer you were really looking for, is it?" A murmur rippled through the room. The trap had been set for her, but she had just turned it around. Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but Usha wasn't done. "Tell me, Elliot," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "have you ever asked a male politician's wife this question? Have you ever looked across a stage and asked a man if he regrets standing by his wife?" The silence that followed was deafening. The power in the room had shifted. Elliot hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. He tried to recover, offering a half smile. "Well, I was just curious." Usha didn't let him finish. "Were you?" she interjected smoothly. "Or were you hoping for hesitation? A stumble, a sound bite that could be twisted?" The audience reacted instantly. A few heads turned, a few chuckles escaped, and even some of the other panelists raised their eyebrows. The energy in the room had changed. Elliot was no longer leading the conversation. She let the pause stretch, then delivered the final blow. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she said. "Women in politics, whether we're the ones in office or the ones married to the men who are always asked if we regret the choices we've made. But I don't recall ever seeing a male guest sit here and be asked the same." Elliot shifted uncomfortably. He knew it, the audience knew it. She had flipped the script entirely. The question, once intended to corner her, had now become an indictment of the very bias that put it forward. Elliot Graves sat back in his chair, his confident smirk now replaced with something more uncertain. He had walked into this moment expecting to be in control, expecting to guide the conversation on his terms, but somehow he was now the one on the defensive. The shift was unmistakable, and worse for him, it was happening in real time, in front of an audience that could see every crack forming in his demeanor. He cleared his throat, a flicker of unease flashing in his eyes as he grasped for a way to steer the conversation back into his hands. He forced a chuckle, attempting to reframe the moment as nothing more than an innocent inquiry. "Well, I was simply giving you the opportunity to speak for yourself," he said, his voice carrying a forced lightness. Usha didn't blink. "And I appreciate that," she replied smoothly. "But I also recognize a loaded question when I hear one." Another ripple of reaction from the audience. A few soft chuckles, a few knowing nods. She had called him out without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat. Elliot glanced down at his notes, flipping through them as if searching for an escape route, but there wasn't one. Usha had already unraveled the premise of his question, and now he was the one left scrambling. Then she struck again, sealing his fate. "Let me ask you something," she said, leaning in slightly. "Do you stand by every political opinion your spouse has ever had?" Elliot inhaled sharply. His hesitation was brief, but the damage was done. The audience saw it. They saw the flicker of discomfort, the tightening of his grip on the desk, the subtle shift in his posture. He tried to recover. "That's different," he said quickly. Usha tilted her head slightly. "How so?" Silence. No response. And just like that, Elliot Graves had lost control of his own interview. Before the panel discussion even ended, clips of Usha Vance's response were already flooding social media. Attendees had discreetly recorded the exchange on their phones, uploading snippets to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where the reaction was immediate and explosive. The hashtag Usha Vance Masterclass began trending within the hour, with thousands of users dissecting the moment, praising her composure, and calling it a perfect takedown of media bias. Political analysts weighed in instantly. Conservative commentators hailed Usha's response as a brilliant dismantling of media double standards, while even some left-leaning journalists acknowledged that Elliot Graves had walked straight into his own trap. Others pointed out the broader implications of her words. Why are women in politics constantly expected to justify their marriages while men are not? Twitter was ablaze with reactions. She didn't just answer the question, she destroyed the question itself. Elliot really thought he had her. Instead, she handed him a masterclass in media bias. Forget politics. This was a lesson in grace under pressure. Women everywhere should take notes. Even memes emerged, with one screenshot of Elliot's stunned expression captioned, "When you realize you played yourself." Others edited dramatic music over the clip, emphasizing the moment his confidence crumbled. By the end of the day, major news outlets were covering the exchange, replaying the footage on primetime television. Some networks tried to downplay the moment, carefully editing the clip to make it seem like a more balanced discussion, but the raw, unedited version had already been seen by millions. Elliot Graves had wanted a viral moment, but not like this. As the clip of Usha Vance's exchange with Elliot Graves continued to dominate social media, news outlets scrambled to respond. Every major network ran segments on the moment, with commentators offering wildly different takes depending on their political alignment. Conservative media hailed it as a brilliant exposure of media bias, praising Usha's ability to remain composed while dismantling a loaded question. Meanwhile, left-leaning commentators struggled to defend Graves, with some arguing that the question had been misinterpreted, while others admitted that he had been outmaneuvered. Political figures also weighed in. Republican lawmakers and commentators rallied behind Usha, using the moment to highlight how women in conservative circles are treated unfairly by mainstream media. Senator J.D. Vance himself addressed the moment in a brief statement, saying, "I've always known my wife is the smartest person in the room. Now the rest of the world knows it too." On the other side, Democratic strategists tried to minimize the damage, avoiding direct commentary on the moment itself. Instead, some dismissed it as a manufactured controversy, while others subtly criticized Elliot Graves' handling of the exchange, admitting that he had played into a narrative that could be used against them. Even within the network that hosted the event, internal discussions erupted. Reports surfaced that producers had not expected the interview to take such a turn, and some were frustrated that Graves had allowed himself to be outplayed so publicly. To contain the fallout, the network released a carefully worded statement defending the integrity of the discussion. But by then, the damage had been done. Usha Vance hadn't just won an interview, she had shifted the conversation. The impact of Usha Vance's viral moment extended far beyond the panel discussion. It became a lesson in power, composure, and media bias. In a world where political debates are often dominated by shouting matches and emotional outbursts, Usha had demonstrated a different kind of strength, the ability to stay calm under pressure and turn a trap into an opportunity. Her response wasn't about aggression or defensiveness, it was about control. She knew exactly what was happening when the question was asked, and instead of reacting impulsively, she took her time, let the silence work in her favor, and then dismantled the premise behind the question itself. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response isn't the loudest one, it's the most deliberate. Beyond politics, her exchange with Elliot Graves sparked a broader conversation about gender and media framing. Why are women in politics and public life expected to justify their choices in ways that men never are? Why is a wife's support for her husband's career questioned, but not the other way around? These weren't new issues, but Usha's response forced people to confront them in real time. For young professionals, politicians, and public figures, the lesson was clear: composure wins. The ability to stay steady in the face of scrutiny, to recognize and reframe unfair narratives, and to maintain confidence without arrogance is one of the greatest strengths a person can have. In the end, Usha didn't just survive the moment, she owned it, and in doing so, she turned what was meant to be a trap into a defining example of how true leadership is about grace under fire. The exchange between Usha Vance and Elliot Graves serves as a powerful lesson in composure, confidence, and the ability to control a narrative. In a world where public figures are often pushed into defensive positions, Usha demonstrated that true power lies not in reacting emotionally, but in responding with precision and intent. Instead of falling into the trap laid before her, she flipped the script, turning an attempt to corner her into an opportunity to expose bias and reshape the conversation. Her ability to stay calm, use silence strategically, and challenge the question itself proved that control in any conversation doesn't always belong to the one asking the questions. It belongs to the one who refuses to be shaken by them. This moment also highlights a broader societal lesson. Women in public life are often forced to justify their personal choices in ways that men are not. Usha's response brought this double standard into sharp focus, reminding us that media framing plays a powerful role in shaping narratives. Ultimately, the takeaway is clear. Confidence is not about having the loudest voice, but about knowing when to speak, how to listen, and how to turn a challenge into an opportunity.